Ada Whitaker stood in the doorway of the mercantile with her carpet bag at her feet and her hands folded at her waist, waiting for Mrs. Coyle to finish with the woman ahead of her in line. The woman was complaining about the quality of the thread, and Mrs. Coyle was nodding with the patient expression of someone who had heard the same complaint about different merchandise every week for 20 years. Ada watched the dust motes turn in the afternoon light and did not move. When her turn came, she asked if there was work to be had, any kind of work, and Mrs. Coyle looked at her the way people look at furniture. They are deciding whether to keep or sell. She said she would ask around. Ada thanked her and picked up her bag and went back out into the street. A man leaning against the post outside the feed store across the way had been watching the whole exchange. He straightened when she came out, not in any hurried way, just the way a man straightens when he has made up his mind about something. His name was Silas Merrill, though Ada did not know that yet. She had come to town on the morning stage with everything she owned and no letter of introduction to anybody. Her brother had died the winter before, and the farm had gone to his wife's people, who made it clear there was no room for a sister-in-law with no children and no claim. Ada had taught school for 2 years in a town 60 miles east, but the position had gone to the minister's niece, and there was no arguing with that. She was 26 years old, and she had learned not to expect courtesy from people who owed her none. Silas Merrill was 34 and had been working the Dunbar Ranch for 3 seasons, breaking horses and mending fence, and doing whatever else needed a steady hand, and a man who did not require supervision. He had come west after the war with no particular destination, and had stopped in this valley because his horse had gone lame, and by the time the horse was sound again, he had work and a reason to stay. He was not a man who made friends easily, but he was known to be fair and to finish what he started, and that counted for more than friendliness, in a place where winters were long and help was scarce. He crossed the street and stood a few feet from where Ada had set her bag down on the boardwalk. He did not introduce himself. He said the Dunbar place needed someone to cook for the hands during the spring work, 6 weeks maybe, room and meals and wages at the end. He said it plain the way a man states the terms of any other transaction. And then he waited. Ada looked at him. He was tall and weathered, with pale eyes, and the kind of face that gave away nothing. She asked if Mrs. Dunbar had sent him, and he said no. Mrs. Dunbar was dead 4 years, and it was Mr. Bade, Dunbar's son, running the place now, and the son had mentioned the need just that morning. She asked if the son knew he was making the offer, and Silas said he did not, but he would by the time they got back to the ranch. Something in the way he said it made her believe him. She picked up her bag and said she would take the work. They rode out in a buckboard Silas had borrowed from the livery, and he did not speak for the first 2 miles. Ada watched the country open up around them, the long grass going silver in the wind, the hills folding into one another like bolts of cloth. She asked how many men she would be cooking for, and he said 8, counting himself. She asked if there was a garden, and he said there was, but it had not been tended in 2 seasons. She did not ask anything else, and he did not offer anything else, and by the time they reached the ranch, the sun was starting to drop behind the western hills. The house was a low structure of logs and planks with a stone chimney at one end and a covered porch that ran the length of the front. The bunkhouse stood 50 yards off, and beyond that were the barns and corrals. Silas pulled the buckboard up to the house and went inside to speak to young Dunbar, and Ada waited on the porch with her bag. She could hear their voices through the open window, Silas stating the arrangement in the same plain way he had stated it to her, and young Dunbar saying he supposed it would do, and that was the end of the negotiation. Silas came back out and showed her to a small room off the kitchen that had a bed and a chair and a window that looked east toward the hills. He said supper was at 6 and breakfast at 5, and if she needed anything to let him know. Then he left her there and went back to whatever work he had been doing before he had crossed the street in town. She unpacked her few things and washed her face in the basin on the chair and stood at the window watching the light fail. She had been in worse places. She had been in places where she was not wanted at all. This was only work, and work she knew how to do, and that was more than she had when she stepped off the stage that morning. The men came in for supper and ate without much talk, and Ada served them and cleaned up after, and banked the fire for the morning. Silas was the last to leave the table, and he paused at the door and said the meal was good, and she said thank you, and that was all. But she noticed he had scraped his plate clean, and so had the others, and in a bunkhouse full of men who had been eating their own poor cooking or no cooking at all, that was a kind of approval that did not need to be spoken. By the end of the first week she had the rhythm of the place. She rose before the men and had coffee ready and biscuits hot when they came in from the early chores. She made stew and beans and cornbread and dried apple pie, and she kept the kitchen clean and the firewood stacked and the water bucket full. The men nodded to her and said, "Thank you, ma'am," and did not linger, and that suited her. Young Dunbar paid her no attention at all, which also suited her. Silas was the only one who seemed to notice anything beyond whether his plate was full. He began leaving things for her without comment. A sack of flour, when the old one ran low. A crate of canning jars, he said, had been in the barn, and were no use to anybody there. Firewood split fine for the cook stove, stacked where she would not have to carry it far. He never mentioned these things, and she never thanked him aloud, but she made sure his coffee was hot, and his plate was filled first, and neither of them spoke about it, and the matter was closed. In the third week, she started working the garden. The ground was hard and full of weeds, but the fence was still good, and there were old seeds in a tin on a shelf in the barn. Silas found her there. One evening, after supper, turning the soil with a spade that was too big for her, he watched for a minute, and then went and came back with a lighter one and traded it for the one she was using. He picked up a hoe and started working the other end of the plot, and they worked in silence until the light was gone. The next evening he was there again, and the evening after that, and by the end of the week, the garden was cleared and planted, and Ada had not asked for his help, and he had not offered it in words. The men noticed the way men notice anything that disrupts the established order of things. One of them, a lean hand named Grady, said it looked like Merrill had found himself a reason to stay past the season, and another one said Merrill had been looking for a reason to stay for 3 years and just had not found one worth mentioning. They said it in the bunkhouse where Silas could hear, and he did not answer, and they did not press him. But the theory was formed, and it settled into the common understanding of the place. In town, Mrs. Burse Coyle asked her husband if he had heard about the Dunbar cook, and he said he had, and she said it was a peculiar arrangement. A woman alone out there with all those men, and he said Silas Merrill was not the kind of man to let anything untoward happen under a roof he slept under, and she said that was not what she meant. And they left it at that, but Mrs. Coyle mentioned it to the postmaster's wife, and the postmaster's wife mentioned it to the schoolteacher. By the time the story had made its way through town and back, it had acquired details that were not there to begin with, and lost details that were. Ada had been at the ranch for 5 weeks when a man rode up to the house in the middle of the afternoon and asked for her by name. She came out to the porch drying her hands on her apron, and the man dismounted and introduced himself as Charles Whitaker, her late brother's wife's cousin. He said he had come to take her back east, that the family had reconsidered, and there was a place for her after all, and he had brought money for her passage. He said it with the air of a man conferring a favor, and he waited for her gratitude. Ada looked at him. She looked at the horse, which was lathered and blowing, and at the man's fine coat and polished boots, and at the way he stood with his weight on one leg, as though he were already tired of being there. She said she had work here, and wages owed her, and she would not be leaving before the work was finished. Charles Whitaker smiled in a way that was not a smile, and said the work was cooking for cow hands, and she could do better than that, and a woman alone in a place like this was not a situation that reflected well on the family. He said it as though the matter were settled. Silas came around the corner of the house. with a hammer in his hand. He had been mending the porch rail, and he set the hammer down and stood at the base of the steps, not blocking the way, but present in a manner that could not be ignored. He asked if there was a problem, and Ada said there was not, and Charles Whitaker said he was family, and this was family business. Silas said that Miss Whitaker had a contract for 6 weeks' work, and the 6 weeks were not up, and if Mr. Sidera Whitaker wanted to wait until the work was finished, he was welcome to take a room in town. He said it without raising his voice, and he did not move, and Charles Whitaker looked from Silas to Ada and back again, and whatever he saw there made him understand that he had misread the situation entirely. He said he would wait in town then, and Ada said that would not be necessary, that she would not be going back east, whether the 6 weeks were up or not. Charles Whitaker's face went tight, and he said she was making a mistake, and she said she had made enough mistakes to know what they looked like, and this was not one. He mounted his horse and rode off without another word, and Ada went back into the kitchen. And Silas picked up his hammer and went back to mending the rail, and neither of them spoke about it. That evening, after supper, Silas stayed at the table after the other men had gone. Ada poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from him, and they sat in silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into night. Finally, he said he had been thinking about staying on past the season, that young Dunbar had offered him a permanent position, and he had been thinking about taking it. He said it slow, the way a man tests the weight of a board before he steps on it. Ada said that sounded like a fine idea. He said the foreman's cabin was empty, had been empty since old Dunbar died, and it had a good roof and a stove, and room enough for 2 if 2 were of a mind to share it. He said he was not a man who had much to offer, but he had steady work and steady habits, and if she was willing, he was asking. Ada looked at him. She looked at his hands, scarred and calloused from years of work, and at his face, which was still giving away nothing, and at the way he was holding himself, very still waiting. She said she was willing. He nodded once, and that was all, and they finished their coffee in silence, and the matter was settled. They were married by the circuit judge when he came through in June, and Ada moved into the foreman's cabin, and the men said they had known it all along, which nobody believed, and nobody troubled them about. The garden came in strong that summer, and Ada put up tomatoes and beans and pickles, and Silas built her a shelf for the jars, and by the time the first frost came, the cabin was full of the smell of wood smoke and coffee, and the sound of Ada humming while she worked. They did not talk much, but they moved around each other with the ease of people who had learned each other's rhythms, and that was a kind of conversation that needed no words. Years later, after Silas was gone and Ada was old and the ranch had changed hands twice, a young woman came to the door asking for work, any kind of work, with a carpet bag at her feet and no letter of introduction. Ada looked at her for a long moment, and then she opened the door wider and said there was always work for someone willing to do it, and the young woman came in, and Ada poured her a cup of coffee and set a jar of pickles on the table, one of the last jars from that first summer, the glass cloudy with age but the contents still good. She did not say where the jar had come from or why she had kept it, but she looked at it the way a person looks at something that has carried them through, and the young woman understood without being told that she was welcome, and that welcome was a thing earned slowly over time, the way water works at anything given enough time.